An old king sat uncomfortably on his throne, fingernails dug into the well-worn grooves in the wood as he waited nervously for the mysterious travelers to approach. All Jerusalem was abuzz with the rumors that these men were searching for a new heir which had just been born. Yet neither the king nor any of his sons had just had a baby. This king was praised early in his reign for his effective administration, his shrewd ability to navigate the perilous waters of Roman politics, so that multiple Caesars had favored him, and he had undertaken some of the greatest building projects the ancient world had ever known, including the enlarging of the ancient temple of his people. But the years had changed the king. He was still shrewd, but jaded. He was still energetic, but his ambition knew no end. He took even wayward glances, whispers, and rumors as hard threats to his reign, and he had no compassion for anyone who stood in his way. He had married 10 times, and he had put to death his most beloved wife and his 2 oldest sons. All Jerusalem groaned under the weight of heavy taxes levied before Romans even got their share. And he left instructions that at the moment of his death, hundreds of the nation's greatest nobles were to be put to death as well. No one would threaten his reign, not family, not nobles, not even a helpless baby or a village of innocents. As these men approached, his eyes narrowed while his lips made a thin, cold smile. He would find out just who the supposed king of the Jews was and put an end to him as he had so many rivals before. You know, this is a heavy, even difficult story to read just 4 days after Christmas. I mean, if I were the senior editor on this project, I probably would have wanted to close with verse 12, with the exotic and adoring magi presenting the baby or child Jesus with gifts on bended knee. But not Matthew. Matthew tells a story that is grittier, more disturbing, but also and ultimately more realistic. And perhaps that's the main value of reading this story so close to Christmas. Because the thing is, Jesus' birth upset the order. He comes as God's chosen king, the one who is to bring about the peace and justice and equity of the kingdom of God. And so all earthly kings who put their own power and privilege first are terrified. Herod is a good but by no means lone example. So terrified is he of the promise that God will, in this child, restore peace and justice, that he is willing to slaughter the infants of a whole region. So Joseph, warned by an angel, flees this carnage and moves his family to Egypt. Now, such a grim account of wholesale massacre and night flights to safety would seem really far-fetched were it not for similar atrocities and tragedies that are happening right now. How many families, for instance, are being dislocated from their homes, even as we gather for worship? And how many children are being starved to death around the world as we finish up or even throw away holiday leftovers? And how many families, maybe even some in our congregations, are contending with their own private sorrows and hardships, only exacerbated by expectations for a perfect Christmas. So while the story that Matthew tells may be dark and difficult, it isn't even a little bit far-fetched, which is why, of course, he tells it. to let us know that in Jesus, Emmanuel, God indeed drew us near to us, took on our lot and our life, and experienced and endured all that we did, disappointment and fear and violence and death, all so that we would know that we are not alone, that we do not suffer alone, fear alone, live alone, or die alone. And if anything, this is Matthew's very real version of the incarnation, the Word made flesh, part 2. The opposite of life and abundance and incarnation that comes from fear is apathy and indifference. And the angel role we experience today is as one who issues a sort of wake-up call to Joseph. And he flees. They become refugees on the move to save their very lives. And the message here is clear. It's time to act. Get up and go is a word that Joseph needs to hear in order to protect his family. And this time there is no question, as Joseph recognizes the call of God, and he does what is necessary. So what must we do to protect life and the most at-risk people in our day who are being threatened and oppressed? Well, we have to be awake. We have to shake off apathy, to awaken from our sleep, to get up and act. So as we face a new year and we've trained our ears to hear God's call in the world, we need to commit to making the journey, letting go of those things that we don't need so that we can prepare to embody the messages of hope and peace and joy and love and full life for all people. You see, God is not only with these characters in this story the first Sunday after Christmas, but God is continuously working through their triumphs and tragedies in order to work for salvation in and for the world. You know, sometimes life is beautiful and wonderful and filled with goodness and grace. And God is part of that, giving blessing and celebrating with us and for us. And sometimes life is hard and gritty and disappointing and filled with heartache. And God is part of that as well, holding on to us and comforting us and blessing us with the promise that God will stay with us through the good and the bad, drawing us ever more deeply into God's loving embrace and promising that nothing, not even death, will separate us from God. So the Christmas story, it begins with the birth of a child. But it doesn't end until that child is grown up, preached God's mercy, been crucified and died and then raised again. Actually, it doesn't end until Jesus draws all of us into that same story, raising us up into new life, even amid the very real challenges that every single one of us faces every single day. And this story matters because it tells the truth. The sometimes difficult truth of unjust rulers and violence and private grief and personal pain and all the rest. But also the always hopeful truth that God doesn't just stand back at a distance, but in Jesus has joined God's own self to our story and is working even now, even here, to grant us new life, that we may not just endure, but flourish, experiencing resurrection joy and courage in our daily lives and sharing our hope with others. One of the places that this story is being lived out in a very real way today is at the Inn Project here in Tucson, sponsored by the United Methodist Church and hosted at First Tucson on the university campus, which is a place that temporarily houses refugees from our southern borders those who have filled out the proper paperwork and are awaiting transportation to their families here in the United States until their immigration hearings roll around. And what we've heard from their stories is that they have suffered incredible hardship to get here. It's their flight from terror, from the King Herods of their own lives, much like the flight of Joseph and Mary and Jesus to Egypt, and like thousands of refugees throughout history. Our Wesley campus pastor, Reverend Hannah Bonner, who has spoken here several times, keeps a blog about her experiences at the inn, and this week she wrote this story, and I'll just tell it in her words. Libros para pintar. A group of adolescents greeted me when I walked through the door of the inn for my overnight shift before going into the toy room to frantically search for those desired coloring books. I searched the craft shelves, and there were none there either. Finally, from the top shelf, my hands landed on a crafting kit, and their eyes opened wide. Podemos? They asked eagerly. Sí, I agreed. Hands flew as they ripped into the packaging, and I tried to explain to them what it was. Pretend Christmas cookies, galletas. We could decorate them together. I had driven to my shift at the inn tonight, feeling a little off-kilter. Last year, I'd have put up a tree at the inn by now with the Wesley students and would have had something festive planned. How had this month passed so fast? I had been feeling so disappointed in myself for having no festive craft or music, but here it was finding us anyway, just what we needed. Our 5 sets of hands flew together as the stickers proved a bit stubborn, so we worked together, and I unpeeled them as they placed them. They looked for a picture to try to match it, while I encouraged them to be free and creative. They didn't need instructions. They had just what they needed. As they finished and we cleaned up together, one of the boys considered for a moment and then took his favorite one and handed it to me. Te recordará a nosotros, he said. It will remind you of us. And the others did the same, solemnly choosing and offering their gifts. And as they went off to play foosball, I stood frozen in stunned silence with the gifts in my hand. They were just what I needed. Soon I felt a tug on my arm as they came back to get me and placed me at the foosball table. Solo 5 minutos, I said, looking at the clock, creeping toward bedtime. Bam! They tossed the ball in the air and it went soaring back and forth. Laughing and delight soon erupted from us as we all discovered that we had finally met worthy adversaries. Goal after goal slammed in as we raced neck and neck. It was just what we needed. Uno más, they begged as we reached the end of the game. Looking around to see the smiling parents sitting up in bed and watching our delight, I relented, letting it creep closer to bedtime. The game stood at 9-9 when my friend, who had first offered his decorated cookie, sent the last goal soaring in, and my partner and I fell to the ground in mock terror and horror as the room laughed. Sending them off to their beds, I waited 10 minutes, went over to the light switch and asked, "Listo?" waiting for agreement from the room before turning out the lights. And as I walked past, handing out extra blankets, the kids waved enthusiastically from the beds where they snuggled with their parents. And their parents smiled happy, satisfied grins. I may not have prepared for it. I may not have been looking for it. But joy still found us tonight. And it was just what we needed. Joy has a funny way of sneaking up on us. Sometimes we discover, as Hannah did, it's when we feel the most empty that we end up the most full. And that's why we tell this disturbing story the Sunday after Christmas. Because in the most empty of times, the life Christ offers can move us to a new place of fullness and joy. Yes, I believe that there are angels among us, that God is making us ready to be messengers of peace and life, flying in the face of fear, saying yes to the command to get up and go, and no to any destruction of life or well-being that we see in the world around us. Amen.